Here we go. Looks like we're all set up. Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to reiterate on this new video that I'd like to acknowledge that the Harvard Art Museums at Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the fourth event in our Busch Hall Conversations. For those of you who aren't familiar yet with these conversations or Busch Hall, we examine the stubborn narratives around issues of nation, race, gender, and identity in German art through the lens of the Busch-Reisinger Museum. And our monthly conversations here on Instagram Live are generously supported by the German Friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum. So many thanks to our Verein members out there. For those of you who have joined us before, you're probably used to seeing curator Lynette Roth. So I'll introduce myself briefly before introducing our guest. I'm Lauren Hanson, the Stefan Engelhorn Curatorial Fellow in the Busch-Reisinger Museum at the Harvard Art Museums. And I've been working with Lynette this year on shaping and developing our Busch Hall channel. And you'll likely be seeing more of me on these conversations. Today, I am pleased to welcome Kirsten Weiss as our fourth guest. Kirsten is currently joining us from Berlin. She is a historian of art and architecture, a curator, and a scholar dedicated to presenting and increasing access to cultural and educational materials. She holds an MA from the Goethe University at Frankfurt and a PhD from MIT down the street from us here in Cambridge. She is the founder of the publishing imprint Weiss Publications and its predecessor, the Gallery Weiss Berlin. Over her career, she's presented work by artists such as Ed Clark, Hans Haacke, Faith Ringgold, Thomas Schutte, Anne Turin, among others. And she's worked for many academic and cultural institutions, including the Harvard Art Museums, the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and the University of Arts in Berlin. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kirsten. Oh, looks like we've got a little bit of a technical delay. I should also just note that one of the main reasons we invited Kirsten to join Busch Hall today is that she has an intimate knowledge of our collection and has contributed to the Busch's history of introducing and enriching knowledge of German art for US audiences. While completing her doctoral studies at MIT, Kirsten was the 2003-2005 Michalka curatorial intern, which we would now, today you would be called a fellow instead of an intern, at the Busch-Reisinger. And during her fellowship, she curated the show called Dependent Objects, Possibilities of Sculpture. So I wonder if you could maybe just start us off by briefly commenting on this exhibition and kind of how it took shape. I know it's been a long time.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, thanks so much for your nice introduction. And it has been a really long time. Thanks for inviting me. But it was a nice show. It was great to have the opportunity to do that. But it is yeah, a long time ago. Yeah, and I'm really happy that you're looking at this material now. So I know that you're working on Posenenske in particular. That's great.
Yeah, that's actually how I came across your show. I had been doing some research on the work we have in our collection by Charlotte Posenenske, and I came across documentation of your exhibition. And I think, like a lot of scholars, historians, art enthusiasts, I first encountered Posenenske's work at my very first Documenta in 2007. It was really this kind of moment of rediscovery. I pulled out my old Documenta guidebook and show some visuals here of the work that was installed in Documenta, which is from the same series, what's referred to or translated as square or rectangular tube series that she did in 1967. But in fact, 3 years before Documenta, you actually showed her work in Dependent Objects. And was, I believe, the very first U.S. venue to show any of Posenenske's work. So how did you become familiar with her work?
Well, she worked in and around Frankfurt. So, before she passed away, she lived in Frankfurt. She passed away in 85, I think.
Yeah.
And she worked in Frankfurt. So I was familiar with her work because it had been shown there. I think it was shown um, sometime in the 90s. There was an exhibition catalog, I think from the late 80s or 90s, that the work had been shown. And I'd come across that because I was kind of working in particular on transatlantic relations, basically, and the kind of implications of that in the post-war era. So, yeah, I came across her work in researching really kind of the spread of American minimal art in Germany. And she was very prevalent, in that kind of era in the 60s. So when she was showing Hundert Fischer, for instance, that's where most of these shown. And so she had a show there as well. So, I'd kind of been familiar with her work already. And when I was thinking about sculpture and kind of thinking about, what did it mean for these German artists that were very, very aware of American work, they all knew American minimal art historians as well, German art historians. It was very prevalent here, even more so than the United States. I mean, I think it was shown, Carl Andre, Judd, all these people were shown more in Germany, even West Germany, than they were in the States. So they got a greater recognition here very quickly, which has to do with a lot of other kind of ways that things were set up and promoted here during the Cold War era. So she was very prevalent. And so when I was thinking about, again, the kind of reception of American art, culture, politics here, it made sense to kind of, obviously show her work because she was really very important until she stopped. Yeah, as you know, as you worked on as well, she stopped working in 1968. But before that, in the 50s, she'd actually been working on stage design. So it took her, 10 years to kind of get to that place where she was, and ended with the cardboard sculptures, and then even ended her artistic practice for political and personal reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for those of us and those of you in the audience who aren't familiar with Posenenske's work, just to give you kind of a brief bio, she was born in 1930 in Wiesbaden and spent the majority of her childhood kind of in hiding during Nazi rule. She studied painting, as you mentioned, in 1951 in Stuttgart under Willy Baumeister, before working as a set and costume designer, and then later, turned to painting. I believe she was doing some sort of like more expressive painting that she said she abandoned because it was too subjective, and she wanted to get to something more closer to objectivity. And she really did gain a lot of recognition in Germany and some abroad for her work that really kind of challenged the criteria for sculpture. So, these cardboard forms or forms that could be made very quickly, they could be ordered. And in fact, you can still order reconstructions of these works today. And the idea was that, what she called, what we translate as the consumer, but I think in German, the Besitzer, it has a little bit of a different connotation. She referred to the collectors as Besitzer of her work. And you could manipulate it, you can configure it however you kind of wanted to. And it created this really, or aimed to create this really kind of democratic way of interacting with these kind of minimalist forms. So when you got these works on loan for dependent objects from Burkhard Brunn, I believe at the time you got them from him, who was sadly passed away recently, was her widower and really a great champion of her work. Did you have something in mind and then they arrived and you wanted to reconfigure them, or how did that interaction work for you? Do you remember?
Well, yes, because of the show, was called Dependent Object. I was looking particularly at, these artists felt very ambivalent about producing these objects. So there was this kind of infancy of kind of, ideas on how to make them less elitist, somehow more accessible. And so a lot of artists, made works that could be handled. And a lot of these works that were in the show were specifically, it was Franz Erhard Walter. We had some reconstruction made of his work that his ex-wife still sewed at the time. Hans Haken's work was reproduced. So he had that reproduced for us. So these were these plexiglass boxes with water in them that you could move, we had some Gerhard Richter, he made these metal balls in which you would be reflected and see yourself in this space. people were very engaged in these kind of issues in, when does like an object, or when does an object of use become an object of art? And they were, again, somewhat ambivalent about that. Obviously, there wasn't an art market as there is now at this point. There was already that kind of commercial aspect, which they, somehow disliked. And they also really wanted to kind of offer opportunities for interaction. So that's what that was the kind of a framework of that. And then the last work was a work, I guess it must have been from the early 70s. It was one of Thomas Schütte's earliest, sculptural pieces, which were actually these kind of long pieces of fabric that you could hang in any room. So they again would be handled and kind of would, adapt to whatever space they were in. So that was the kind of idea. So basically had to be those objects. There were some more, there's other, those are the last ones, as you said, she did these actually really beautiful kind of landscape paintings which are very abstract. So she kind of like, went more and more into kind of abstraction. And then she really was interested in kind of industrial production in the end. So that's why she came to those cardboard constructions with the plastic screws. There were some other objects that would have been great, some metal objects. There's some metal objects with doors, but there's only one or two of them, and they wouldn't have been possible to ship over to the States. Whereas those objects were, perfect for that kind of purpose, and that wanted them to be as well, too.
Right. Yeah. That was in the 2007 document in one of the spaces where you could kind of move through.
Those, yeah. So it made sense, and also with the kind of materials that the other objects have to have those there. And the work that you're writing about, those were the objects that were later then purchased for the museum. Those were abstract metal wall pieces, which are also wonderful. But for that purpose and for that setting, it made the most sense to have these kinds of objects. She wanted people to actually move them during the exhibition, which obviously we couldn't do not in that exhibition, but that's what her initial idea was. And there's nice photos of where, people were kind of dragging them around and moving them and reconfiguring them. Again, of course, we didn't do that at the museum, unfortunately, but that was her idea as well. We could do it with the reproductions.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, this idea of kind of challenging then the art market in the 60s and really kind of refuting the commercialization of art and thinking about the kind of commodification. And I mean, it's interesting that now her work shown in museums does that, it resists that interaction now in museums, when in fact, that's what she was trying to kind of dig at and get at. And as you mentioned, in fact, moving more toward an interest in industrial materials. And she did, in fact, abandon the art practice in 1968 and became a sociologist, really focusing on, industrial work and labor. And that to me was something that was really interesting. I started, thinking about her work in terms of this withdrawal, or kind of in relationship to Lee Lozano's dropping out, and what might have made these women in particular kind of retreat from, at least in the U.S., this the minimalist movement, very sort of male dominated market that Posenenske did not embrace, or was interested in a minimalism that really came out of different origins in Europe. And I think really introducing her into that conversation is so valuable.
Yeah. I mean, there were also obviously other problems at the time, that people cared about. So that was another, it was one thing. I think she kind of did a kind of like fast development through what she wanted to achieve. And she went through a really kind of like broad area of working with materials. She also did these pieces with tape, which are really wonderful. It's like colored electrical tape that she just, so again, she kind of developed all these things very quickly. And, one was that she, didn't feel like that she could, she specifically said she couldn't really contribute enough. And again, there were, other issues that people were worried about, interested in.
Really, I mean, the 68 the 68 watershed year, right? I mean, that's the moment in which she kind of shifts careers, but I think the interests were the same when she was an artist. It was just the vehicle through which she could, try and achieve those political interests. Yeah, I mean, we're thinking about installing her work in our 60s gallery. They've been up in the museum, the metal relief series. We have a series that they look essentially like metal folded and then placed on the wall. And as you mentioned, about 5 years, I think, after your exhibition of her work at the Busch-Reisinger acquired 2 of these prototypes in red. And then our current curator, Lynette Roth, another 5 years later, acquired the sort of the reconstructions in yellow of those red prototypes, really to resist this propagation of the original artwork, or the singular that Posenenske really fought so hard to dispel. So we want to put those up together, and probably they'll be in proximity to a Richard Serra work that we have. And I think, there's such a maybe a contrast in the way in which they were working, or maybe the way we have sort of associations of this really like heavy masculinist approach, really kind of monumental, and hers, which is aims to be, I think, a bit more intimate, or have more of a kind of intimate relationship between the viewer and the object.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, could be. I mean, she did like doing stuff herself. She did weld.
Yeah.
So she,
Right. She wasn't sending it off to the manufacturer. Well, Sarah did, right? Yeah.
So, no, I'm glad that you guys can put those up. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think what is sort of an interesting trend too, or to think about the position of women artists in the 20th century, is you have this kind of rediscovery of women who were really central and important in their moment, that you have sort of runs the gamut from artists like Maria Lasnig or Howardina Pindell or Vera Molnar, Mary Corse, all these artists who are kind of having retrospectives dedicated to their work in the last 10 years. And Charlotte Posenenske really kind of fits that as well. And, I've kind of wondered if she kept working through the 70s and 80s or 80s until her death, would that interest have been maintained and there wouldn't have been a need for this rediscovery, or kind of if she would have been lost to history like many of these other women, kind of overshadowed by some of the figures who were perhaps more willing to play the game.
I think that's a whole another story, because that's, so strongly dependent on the art market as well. And that's, again, that's a whole nother.
Oh, for sure. It's just speculative. It's just interesting to think about. But that she is kind of part of this last, in this last decade, this rediscovery of many, people of color or women artists who, were working alongside men whose names we are much more, or audiences tend to be much more familiar with. So I'm really thrilled to see this resurgence of interest in her work, and the major retrospective traveled around. Yeah, it's fantastic. I wonder if you have any other thoughts on this relationship between U.S., the form of sort of like U.S. minimalism or European minimalism, and this, you said in the 80s you were very aware of Charlotte Posenenske, and when you came to the U.S. there wasn't so much an awareness. Have you thought much about this? It sounds like you've thought a lot about this transatlantic relationship. I wonder if you might add something about that to the conversation.
I was definitely not very aware of her in the 80s. I mean, there was a...
Sorry.
She has shown sometimes, this was really the kind of like research that I was doing, but, she had been shown. I just wanted to say, not like her work hadn't been shown, just wasn't.
Sure.
There were shows. I don't know. I mean, German artists, they didn't call the work minimalism, right? I mean, there was, again, also obviously for well-known reasons, yes, the United States did have kind of like a cultural hegemony, again, for many reasons, but there was also, a resistance to that. So while, again, German artists are very, very aware of the work, they didn't necessarily, align themselves voluntarily with it, So, it's kind of, again, they're looking at minimalism, and they're obviously interested and appreciative of some of the aspects of it, but on the other hand, they're just really kind of interested in also working with different materials, like the Hans Hake objects that we had in the show. Those are things that he started working on in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
This was really like the direct, imminent kind of like post-war times when these people started working. I mean, these were, they were all at this age that they started, like right after the war.
Right. The generation of kind of the Kriegskinder, the men born in the 30s.
Just like those in East Germany were, but they had a very, very kind of different influence. The first documentaries were very, very important for these people too, of course. And again, they were, there was the Marshall Plan. They had a lot of access to anything coming from the United States. So, it's a very kind of, it's a situation that's very particular to Western Germany.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and then you have, as you mentioned before, figures like Konrad Fischer, who just sent artists in New York a plane ticket, like Carl Andre. Here's a plane ticket, come to my gallery, install something, and so that already creates this kind of transatlantic dialogue that's not necessarily just about collecting or exhibiting work, but also about the kind of the relationship and that conversation.
Yeah. Well, they did that, couldn't afford to ship like pieces of steel.
Exactly. Right. And certainly those are things
are manufactured in Netherlands, and so he thought it would be, easier, which is true, and cheaper.
Exactly, yeah.
Will come. They had this Konrad Fischer had this big, 7-room apartment, he and his wife, in Düsseldorf, and so people would just come for a little while and have work produced there instead of shipping the work. So,
Right, which I think then had this sort of side effect or benefit to it, that you actually have, the artist there and creating on site instead of just shipping the work and not having that kind of conversation or dialogue. Yeah, well, I mean, I see we're kind of going over time, so I wrap things up, but I wanted to thank you so much for joining us and allowing me to really kind of highlight work of yours that perhaps you haven't thought about in many years, but that I think really is part of the Busch-Reisinger's history and really central role in introducing a lot of German art to U.S. audiences and really shaping our understanding of German identity in the U.S. through German art. And so I think that it's important to remember these moments. And I wanted to thank you so much for joining us. And I don't know if you maybe want to let people know kind of what you're working on now and maybe where they can find more about the publications and exhibitions you've been doing recently.
Well, anyway, thank you first for working on these things. Glad that, it's the tradition of these interns, fellows, whatever continues. That's great. And it's nice that you really have this kind of time to really, look at these things. That's really great.
Thanks
for inviting me. I'm working right now. I'm working on a book with Faith Ringgold, and it's going to come out at the end of the year. Actually, it's going to be distributed early next year through she has a couple of institutional shows, and this is the we're specifically working with her directly to show a range of works that she did from the late 60s to the late 70s that are kind of, a lot of them are graphic works, but that they have a kind of very specific political content, like her work does, but these are works where she's really kind of looking into kind of working in abstraction, references to pop art, developing her own typography, and they're interesting in that way, and we hope to make them again. We have text that goes with each of the works, and so
fantastic.
It's going to take a bit longer, so the end of the year. So
great. Well, everyone keep an eye on Weiss publications, and I believe some of your previous publications under the imprint Weiss Berlin are available on Printed Matter. So if anyone's interested in taking a look at these really, really gorgeous publications and some really great essays in them as well, please take a look at that. So thank you so much.
I have a new website. So.
Oh, yeah. Great.
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Well, soon. Keep an eye down the line. We'll let you all know through Busch Hall, our Busch Hall guests. We'll let you all know when that
happens. Yeah.
full publication's coming out. We'll keep you informed. So great. Well, thank you so much. Enjoy your evening in Berlin.
Yes.
I had a moment of panic last night that we were going to be talking during the Euro Cup Germany game, and I was like, "Oh no, have I major faux pas scheduling this?" But it's in a few hours, so we lucked out. All right.
Luck with your work. Can't wait.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.